Hi APUSHers, here we are. I want to go through the Period 2 study guide to get you prepared for the test. If you've had me before, you understand at this point, these are the things that you should be really focusing on. I will tell you that this test is stimulus-based multiple choice and one short answer question. So those questions that you had to read and analyze a big paragraph and then answer questions about it, that's what you're going to have, probably about 6 or 8 of those, and then just a few more multiple choice, and then one short answer question. If you remember, we did a practice of a short answer question on tobacco as a cash crop. So this is a comprehensive review. It's not going to be, you're going to find the answers to the test if you just look this over. So make sure you really understand it. So we'll start out, and I want to tell you, you need to know the basics of really all of the 13 colonies, where they were, when they were settled, why they were settled, kind of the demographics. So perhaps looking at other people's colonial advertisements might help you get a sense a little bit more. I would look at that colony chart that I had handed out and really be familiar with that, of the social, political, and economic demographics that happened in the colonies. Also be aware of the relationship with natives. The racial hierarchy was happening in British colonies. In the French areas of settlement, there was definitely not this racial hierarchy, but in British colonies there were, and it contributed very much to how colonies prospered, how colonies expanded, and the relationship with Native Americans as you got further and further into the interior. So that's really important to know. The frontier areas came into more contact with American Indians. Some had peaceful relationships and some did not. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more specifically about Virginia. Their success was based on tobacco as a cash crop. Now remember, Jamestown is the first permanent settlement way back in 1607. So they have been around probably the longest, and they learned how to use tobacco to their benefit and make a lot of money. It was not really religious. There was a lot less religious stance. There was more focus on the economics and democracy. Remember, the House of Burgesses was the first elected legislature way back in 1619. So keep those things in mind. We have Bacon's Rebellion, the tastiest of all rebellions. This was all about, and look at the dating on this. This is by 1676. Now remember, tobacco takes a lot of time and energy, well, especially energy, to harvest. And so the Virginia colonies relied a lot on indentured servants. Now others did too, but especially for the tobacco crops. And Bacon's Rebellion happens because there were frontiersmen who were, there's the bell, frontiersmen who were usually poor landowners. So they might have previously been indentured servants. They did their time as an indentured servant, and now they had to make a life for themselves. So they probably went further inland in the interior, but they weren't really rich. So there were these big groups of frontiersmen that were rebelling against Tidewater officials for being ignored. They felt like, you rich people over on the coastline, you're not paying attention to us. And remember, there's a House of Burgesses, which should say that everybody is, have a say in their government. Nathaniel Bacon, felt unsupported against the Native American attacks. He felt like his government should have been doing more to protect him and his neighbors. After Bacon's death, though, remember, Bacon died kind of a poor death, and it didn't really do any good for Bacon's rebellion, but it did lead to kind of an end of indentured servitude. They realized, we can't keep bringing these people over, and then they're poor and without land, and they're going to be mad, and this is creating conflict or tension, and so it shifted to slavery. And this is when we're going to see a real increase in the uptick of slaves coming into the American colonies, into the colonies in the United States as compared to, say, in the Caribbean, although that continues as well. In Massachusetts, they had a theocracy. They had strict religious following. Massachusetts Bay Colony is established, around 1620. And Winthrop, John Winthrop, City on a Hill. He was a Puritan minister, and he really kind of set the tone for the Massachusetts Bay Colony, for Boston to be the model for future colonists. They were to be the moral high ground, if you will, as the city upon a hill, for all those who were to come. And so they were expected to really live and uphold these strict Puritan laws. The group of Puritans who mostly settled in these areas were pretty educated. They were a very religious group. They often came as families, as compared to in Virginia, where they would come as individuals. The Puritans often came as families, and they settled in cities, not necessarily in the frontier areas. So Boston and Providence were big cities that were being established by Puritan followings. And then later on, we have the Great Awakening. Now, the Great Awakening is this religious revival, especially coming after and at the tail end of the Enlightenment in Europe. Now, the Enlightenment also spread to America, and it was this religious revival that was focused on the spirituality of the individual. And what I mean by that is the Enlightenment brought a lot of common sense in that people were able to think on their own, except they started to get away from religion. And so the Great Awakening were people like Jonathan Edwards who said, listen, you can think on your own and have God in your life and understand God without somebody just telling you. And so he was this kind of, the Great Awakening was this fire and brimstone kind of teaching and preaching time of repentance through an emphasis on a calling from God. You have to listen to God. Listen to what God is asking you. You can do this, but you need to do it kind of idea. In Maryland, Maryland was one of those unique colonies because it was kind of bordered on the middle and the southern colonies. And it was really established by Lord Baltimore, because he was granted land from the king as a refuge for Catholics. And then they passed this Maryland Toleration Act, we're talking 1649 here, to allow all Christians religious freedom. And so if you were Catholic, you were probably not going to go and live in Massachusetts. Like, you just weren't actually going to go and live in Massachusetts, or Rhode Island for that matter, and probably maybe not New Jersey. But Maryland might be a really good choice for you. If you were rich, you might go to Virginia, but you got to be pretty wealthy in order to go into Virginia, unless you want to go way out in the frontier land. In New York, New York is one of those middle colonies that's kind of a unique border between having big cities like New York and then more wilderness area and closer to, say, Great Lakes area, which would come into more contact with Native Americans. So in New York, the big thing that I want you to know that came out of New York is in 1735. And this is all about the Zenger trial. John Peter Zenger was a newspaper publisher. And remember, all the news at this time is coming from England. Like, there might be local news, but chances are, you remember the idea of Anglicization? The colonists wanted to be actually like British subjects. They wanted to identify as British colonial subjects, not as really Americans. They hadn't established that kind of identity. So most of the news was coming from England. Well, John Peter Zenger wrote a pretty scathing attack on some of the colonial regulations and government policies, and he was arrested for it. And the trial said that basically, in the end, truth isn't libel. You are not trying to sabotage or smear somebody's name if you're telling the truth. You can't be faulted for telling the truth. And so this really leads to people being able to speak out against their government, and they began to question authorities on their own. Now look at what time or period we're talking about, 1735. This again is coming after the Enlightenment, when people started saying, but that's not how it should be, and really started questioning things themselves, not relying on authorities to do the questioning. The Dominion of New England. I threw this in this area because it was a kind of a policy, I guess you could say, that they appointed Sir Edmund Andros, and he was the overseer of many of the colonies, New York, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Rhode Island, into a single royal colony. Now think about that. If this is in 1686, and for quite some time now, these colonies have kind of been doing it their way on their own. Now there's one guy who's being appointed to kind of control all of them in one. And this rubbed a lot of people the wrong way. It was mostly to control trade and enforce the strict navigation policies that to control that direct trade route, and people didn't like that, and they were really upset about this. It didn't last for very long, but we do really understand where the conflict began with that tension between royal authorities and local colonial governments. Metacom's War, I cannot stress to you enough how important this is. The relationship with Native Americans cannot be forgotten. Metacom's War was sometimes known as King Philip's War. And so the Wampanoag tribe and others joined in alliance against New England colonists after there was rapid settlement in their area. King Philip felt like he was being pushed out, and all of the resources in those areas were basically being gobbled up by colonists who were then sending those resources back to England. And Native Americans like the Wampanoags felt a little like not only left out, but left without. And so it results in Metacom's War. This is a really important war that a lot of people died. Like a large percentage of colonists died, and a really large percentage of Native Americans died. Yet it probably doesn't get the attention that it should. But Metacom is killed. Essentially, he's hired by a warring tribe, by some colonists to kill him. He is killed. And after that, and you see Metacom's Wars around 1675 to 1676, the Native American relationship with colonists really started to kind of break down, and it declined, and it began this long period of displacement, of revenge, of enforcement. So if you didn't get a chance to watch the video on Metacom's War, if you didn't read in the book, I think it was page 114 or someplace in the book I had told you to read, make sure you are really understanding Metacom's War. Salutary neglect is the unwritten policy of allowing colonists to trade and self-govern themselves. This has been basically, as long as you're sending money our way, Britain, the colonists to Britain, we're going to let you do your thing until there's problems that need to be solved and money needs to be had. And so now things are going to change. And one of the first things that kind of starts to erode away the salutary neglect is the Navigation Acts. It first began in the 1660s, and then they kind of continued on. It would be one again, and then another decade, and then so on and so forth, and they really continued on for quite some time. The first Navigation Act said that there can be trade only by British-built ships, so they had to be built in Britain. You could only send the goods to English ports, and you could only send certain goods to England. And so some of those goods, especially like the really high demand goods, such as indigo or tobacco or some of those things that were in very high demand, sugar, you could have made a better profit somewhere else, but you weren't allowed to do it. And so this leads to things like smuggling and defiance and a lot of tension between, once again, royal authorities and colonial self-governments. The colonists resisted these acts because of salutary neglect, the differences among the royal authorities, and an increasing idea of self-government. Mercantilism. Mercantilism is an economic trade system that would provide raw materials for the mother country and keep a favorable balance of trade. It really kept this direct trade route between the colonies and Britain. And that mercantilist system is what exactly Britain wanted to keep control of. And then the rise of slavery. So some things that we need to know generally and then a little bit more specifically. This was especially in the southern colonies because of the labor-intensive crops that they had and the length of their growing season. You didn't see slavery so much in, say, the New England colonies because they didn't have a very long growing season. You maybe didn't see it in places like Pennsylvania. They had a fantastic area to grow lots of crops, those breadbasket colonies, but they, like in Pennsylvania, for instance, they were many Quakers and they did not allow slavery. They thought it was a moral injustice. So we see it mostly in the South. Why do we see a rise of slavery? Well, there was difficulty enslaving Native Americans, which we saw even from the last period before with, the encomienda system. And there becomes a lack of indentured servants after Bacon's Rebellion, when they realized we can't keep having these poor individuals come and then they're not really contributing well to our society but making problems for us. They turned to a different route, and that was slavery. Some of the economic issues of slavery. In the oligarchy style of government, especially in the South, that means that there was rule by a few especially wealthy people, and those tended to be wealthy landowners. And it allowed for kind of a social hierarchy, which means you could treat slaves however you wanted because you were in control. You had the power. There were really no rights for slaves that were given. The demographic rise. Children who were born to African mothers, despite their father's race, were considered enslaved. We talked about that word perpetuity. However, do remember that slaves, people who were enslaved, did not just accept this position. They tried to maintain their culture. They tried to maintain their language, their identity, their religious practices. It was not something that slaves just absolutely accepted. In fact, they did many things to try to overcome it and stop it and rebel against it. The geographic reasons for slavery, well, again, large-scale plantations in the southern colonies. There's no need for it really so much in the north. And then we see some issues of uprising. It might have been covert styles of uprising, like the Stonewall Rebellion we see in the New York City riots. But there is also things like covert means of uprising, like work slowdowns and sabotage and things that would prevent the landowner from making the most efficient profit off of their slaves. So that's it. We'll come together tomorrow or Friday and do kind of a timeline review so you can think of all these things as this before this and this after this. And then I'll see you for the test on Monday and Tuesday. Talk to you soon. Bye.